I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Monday in mid-October, and the New York air was crisp enough to make you think about switching to a heavier overcoat, though inside the brownstone on West 35th Street, the climate remained as steady as Nero Wolfe's ego. I was at my desk in the office, trying to balance the checkbook against a rather staggering invoice for several hundred odontoglossum seedlings when the doorbell rang. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, as he always is from 9 to 11 in the morning, which meant I was the one who had to deal with whatever the city had decided to throw at our doorstep. When I opened the door, I didn't see a process server or a delivery boy. I saw a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts found in a very old, very prestigious library. He was about 60, wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better decades and a pair of spectacles so thick they made his eyes look like goldfish swimming in bowls. "Is this the residence of Mr. Nero Wolfe?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp that suggested he hadn't spoken to a human being in at least a week. "On his good days," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "On his bad days, it's a fortress of solitude. I'm Archie Goodwin. Can I help you with something? Or are you just admiring the masonry?" "I am Dr. Alistair Finch," he said, clutching a battered leather satchel to his chest as if it contained the crown jewels. "I have a problem that requires intellectual intervention. It concerns the Davenport collection." The name rang a bell, albeit distant. The Davenport collection was a hoard of rare, centuries-old manuscripts that had recently been donated to the university, sparking a fair amount of chatter in the Sunday book sections. "Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids," I told him, checking my watch. "He doesn't descend until 11. You can wait in the front room, but I should warn you, he doesn't take cases involving old paper unless there's a very good reason. He finds it dusty." "The reason," Finch said, stepping into the foyer with a nervous glance over his shoulder, "is that someone is trying to prove I don't exist, or rather, that the Alistair Finch who curated that collection for 30 years is a phantom." I showed him into the office and gave him a chair. He sat on the edge of it, his fingers drumming a frantic rhythm on his satchel. When 11 o'clock rolled around, the elevator hummed and Wolfe stepped out, looking like a mountain in a yellow silk vest. He crossed the room to his oversized chair, performed the complex maneuver of seating himself, and looked at Finch with the expression of a man who had just found a moth in his favorite sweater. "Archie," Wolfe rumbled, not even looking at our guest. "Who is this?" "This is Dr. Alistair Finch, sir. He's a scholar and he says he's being erased." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Finch. "Erased?" "A biological impossibility, though I suppose a bureaucratic one is quite common. Why have you come to me?" "I am not a genealogist, nor am I a public relations firm." Finch leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Wolfe, I have spent 3 decades as the primary archivist for the Davenport estate. Last week, a letter was sent to the university board. It contained a series of photographs and documents suggesting that the real Alistair Finch died in a climbing accident in Switzerland in 1994, and that I am an imposter who has spent 20 years living his life to gain access to the collection's secrets." Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly, the only sign that he was even remotely interested. "And am I what?" Finch blinked. "The imposter." "Good heavens, no!" Finch cried, nearly dropping his satchel. "But the documentation is flawless. Birth certificates, death records, even dental records. If this is allowed to stand, my life's work, the Davenport catalogue, will be discredited. The university will seize the collection and I will be, well, I don't know what I'll be. A man without a name." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers beginning their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. He usually hates cases involving long-distance history, but there was something about the precision of the attack that seemed to pique his interest. Or perhaps he just liked the idea of a man being replaced by a ghost. "The Davenport collection," Wolfe mused. "It contains the lost journals of the Venetian explorer, doesn't it? The ones that supposedly map a route that didn't exist. Finch nodded eagerly. The Rialto journals, they are the heart of the collection, and they are currently being prepared for auction to settle the estate's debts. I see, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic purr. A man's identity is called into question just as a multi-million-dollar asset is poised for sale. The timing is almost as precise as your Swiss death record. Archie, take Dr. Finch's details and find out who stands to profit if the Davenport catalogue is declared the work of a phantom. So you'll take the case? I asked, already reaching for my notepad. I will investigate the disruption, Wolfe corrected me. I have a profound distaste for people who use documentation to rewrite reality. It is a slight against logic itself. Dr. Finch, you will leave that satchel with Mr. Goodwin, and you will return tomorrow at 9. I suspect your hidden past has more to do with the living than the dead. As I showed Finch out, I noticed he looked more terrified than relieved. He handed over the satchel like it was a live bomb. I locked it in the safe and looked at Wolfe. Identity theft in the ivory tower? I asked. It sounds a bit dry for you, doesn't it? It is not dry, Archie, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. It is a strategic maneuver. Someone is trying to move a mountain by questioning the ground it stands on. It is an audacious gambit, and I wish to see the hand that played it. The following morning, the brownstone was no longer the quiet sanctuary of orchids and precise schedules. It had become a staging ground for a very civilized type of warfare. Wolfe had directed me to summon the key players of the Davenport board and the university's legal counsel for a preliminary inquiry. By 10 o'clock, the front room was occupied by 4 individuals who looked as though they had been vacuum-sealed in their suits. Wolfe remained upstairs, a tactical delay he used to let the suspect's nerves marinate in the silence of his office, while I played the role of the watchful sentry, leaning against my desk and taking a mental inventory of the intruders. First, there was Silas Vane, the university's provost, a man whose skin had the texture of old parchment and whose eyes seemed to be constantly calculating the cost of a reputation. He paced the rug with a rhythmic, irritating squeak of his shoes, clearly annoyed that he had been summoned to a private residence. Next to him sat Dr. Evelyn Vance, a younger, sharper academic who had been Finch's chief rival for the Davenport chair. She didn't pace, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded over a leather portfolio, her gaze fixed on the safe where Finch's satchel was locked away. In the corner, Julian Thorne, the estate's primary executor, was occupied with his reflection in the glass of the bookshelves. He was a man of expensive tastes and, I suspected, even more expensive debts. He looked less like a scholar and more like a man who was waiting for a check to clear. Finally, there was Marcus Reed, the university's lead investigator, a man who looked like he had been born with a frown and a subpoena. He was the one who had officially received the anonymous packet detailing Finch's supposed death in Switzerland. The tension in the room was so thick you could have spread it on a cracker. Nobody spoke. They all just waited for the mountain to move. At exactly 11 o'clock, the elevator hissed, and Wolfe stepped out. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked to his oversized chair, performed the complex maneuver of seating himself, and looked at the group with the expression of a man who had just found a beetle in his salad. "Gentlemen, and Dr. Vance," Wolfe began, his voice a low, melodic rumble that immediately commanded the room. "You are here because a man's existence has been called into question by a collection of papers. Dr. Finch claims to be Alistair Finch. You have documents claiming he is an impostor. In this house we do not worship documents, we worship the truth that they so often attempt to obscure." "Mr. Wolfe," Silas Vane snapped, stopping his pacing, "the documentation is not merely paper, it is a certified death record in the Swiss Alps. If the man we have entrusted with the Davenport collection for 20 years is a fraud, The university is facing a scandal of catastrophic proportions. The Rialto journals alone are worth a fortune. If their cataloguing is the work of a phantom, their value evaporates. Or perhaps, Wolfe suggested, his eyes narrowing to slits, their value is merely transferred. Dr. Vance, you were the first to raise concerns about Finch's erratic behavior last month. Was that based on academic observation or a more personal interest in the Davenport chair? Evelyn Vance didn't flinch. I raised concerns because Finch was becoming secretive about the journals. He was rewriting the provenance of certain entries. It looked like he was trying to hide something, or perhaps prepare the collection for a private buyer before the auction. A private buyer? Wolfe shifted his gaze to Julian Thorne. The executor of an estate in debt would certainly find a private buyer more convenient than a public auction, wouldn't he, Mr. Thorne? Less scrutiny, more flexibility. Thorne straightened his tie, a nervous twitch in his cheek betraying his composure. My primary concern is the Davenport family. If Finch is a fraud, the entire donation agreement is void. The family could reclaim the collection and sell it on their own terms. I am merely following the legal trail. The trail, as you call it, is remarkably well paved, Wolfe remarked, his fingers beginning their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. Marcus Reed, you received the anonymous packet. Tell me, did you find it curious that the dental records of a man who supposedly died in 1994 were so readily available for a private investigation? Reed frowned. We verified the sources. They were legitimate Swiss hospital records. My job is to protect the institution, not to worry about the convenience of the evidence. Wolfe leaned back, his gaze sweeping the room. The outsiders had brought their ambitions and their deceits into the sanctuary, and I could tell by the set of Wolfe's jaw that he was already calculating the weight of their lies. He didn't like the provost's arrogance. He didn't like the executor's greed, and he clearly didn't like the clinical coldness of Dr. Vance. Archie, Wolfe said, without looking at me, Mr. Reed and Mr. Vane will leave their contact information. Dr. Vance and Mr. Thorne will stay a while. I have a question regarding the physical condition of the Rialto journals that I suspect only the most intimately involved can answer. As I showed the provost and the investigator out, I felt the back of my neck prickle. The brownstone was no longer a place of quiet study. It was a cage filled with people who were trying to rewrite history to suit their bank accounts. I walked back into the office to find Wolfe staring at Evelyn Vance as if she were a particularly difficult crossword puzzle. The game was on, and the disruption had just begun. By the time the office door clicked shut behind the last of the faculty, the room felt like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. Wolfe was back in his chair, his eyes closed, which meant he was either digesting the lunch Fritz had served or he was mentally sorting the 4 visitors into neat little categories of guilt. I didn't interrupt the process. I just sat at my desk and watched the rain streak against the office windows, thinking about how a pile of old paper could make people act like they were auditioning for a tragedy. The legwork was mine, as usual, and I had a feeling the university's ivy-covered walls were hiding more than just a few academic grudges. Archie, Wolfe rumbled, his eyes remaining closed. The list. I picked up my notebook. Silas Vane, the provost. He's obsessed with giving and his own legacy. If Finch is a fraud, Vane gets to play the hero who saved the university's honor. Then there's Dr. Evelyn Vance. She's sharp, ambitious, and was passed over for the Davenport chair 3 years ago. She's been digging into Finch's past like she's looking for oil. His ex-wife, for back alimony, is currently suing Julian Thorne, the executor, and has a gambling habit that's not exactly a secret. He needs the Rialto journals sold quickly and quietly. Finally, investigator Marcus Reed. He's a former cop with a pension and a chip on his shoulder. He's the one who verified the Swiss records, and he seems a little too satisfied with how neatly they fit together. Wolfe made a sound that might have been a grunt of acknowledgement. The Rialto journals are the key, Archie. Identity is a peripheral concern. One does not erase a man unless his presence is a barrier to a more tangible goal. Visit the university library. I want to know who has accessed the Davenport collection in the last month, and specifically, who has spent time with the 6th volume of the journals. It is the only one that discusses the geography of the northern trade routes. I spent the afternoon proving that a university campus is just a small town with more degrees and less common sense. I started at the library, a Gothic fortress that smelled of floor wax and repressed ambitions. I didn't bother with the official channels. I found a graduate student named Miller who looked like he hadn't seen the sun since the spring semester and had a weakness for expensive cigars. For the price of a handful of my best Havanas, Miller confirmed that Evelyn Vance had spent every Saturday for the last 2 months in the Davenport room. More importantly, he mentioned that Julian Thorne had visited twice, always after hours, escorted by Marcus Reed. "Did they look at the journals?" I asked, leaning against a stack of medieval law texts. "Thorne did," Miller whispered, looking around nervously. "He had a magnifying glass and a camera. Reed just stood by the door. But here's the strange part, Mr. Goodwin. After they left the second time, I noticed a smudge of blue ink on the edge of the 6th volume. It wasn't there before. It looked like a stamp or a watermark that shouldn't be in a 16th century manuscript." I thanked him and moved on to the faculty club. I found a retired genealogy professor who was happy to talk about Alistair Finch for the price of a double bourbon. He confirmed that the real Finch had indeed been a world-class climber, but he also remembered that Finch had a twin brother, Arthur, who had disappeared in Europe in the early 90s. The university records only mentioned Alistair. I headed back to 35th Street as the city lights started to flicker on through the drizzle. My head was spinning with twins, blue ink and bank debts. Every one of them had a reason to want Finch out of the way, and every one of them had a reason to want the journals manipulated. When I walked into the office, the lights were low, and Wolfe was already in his chair, his fingers interlaced over his middle. "Vance is a regular at the library," I reported, dropping my hat on the rack. "Thorne and Reed are doing midnight tours with cameras, and there's a rumor that our Dr. Finch might have a missing twin. Plus, someone left a blue ink smudge on the sacred journals." Wolfe opened his eyes, and they were sharp, clear, and utterly focused. A twin, a blue watermark, and a midnight photography session. "The pieces are beginning to cluster, Archie, but we are missing the catalyst. The trespass in this house was not about the man, it was about the proof of his forgery, and I suspect the person who sent that anonymous packet is currently wondering why I haven't yet declared Dr. Finch a ghost." "So what's next?" I asked. "Tomorrow we invite the catalyst to dinner," Wolfe said. "Inform Dr. Vance that I require her presence at 8, alone. I wish to discuss the chemical composition of blue ink from the year 1994. The following evening, the brownstone was wrapped in a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Wolfe was in the plant rooms, and Fritz was occupied with the silver, leaving me to my thoughts and a cold cup of coffee. The pressure was mounting, and the information I'd gathered at the university had shifted the temperature of the case. It's one thing to have a group of academics arguing over a chair. It's another thing entirely when you have an estate executor and a university investigator, taking midnight strolls through a rare manuscript collection with a camera and a magnifying glass. "Archie," Wolfe's voice came through the house phone, sounding like a low rumble of distant thunder. "Has Dr. Vance arrived?" "She's in the front room, sir," I replied, checking my watch. "Exactly on time. And she looks like she's ready to defend a thesis or start a small war." "She's carrying a briefcase that looks like it's made of steel. Bring her in," Wolfe commanded, "and Archie, ensure the red leather chair is positioned so that the light from the desk lamp catches her hands. I wish to observe the state of her cuticles." I showed Evelyn Vance into the office. She sat down with a grace that was entirely too controlled. She didn't look like a woman who was worried about her career. She looked like a woman who was playing a very high-stakes game of chess and was waiting for Wolfe to make a move. Wolfe descended minutes later, his bulk filling the room as he took his seat. He didn't offer her a drink or a greeting, he simply stared at her until the silence became a physical weight. "Dr. Vance," Wolfe began, his voice a melodic purr, "Mr. Goodwin tells me you are a frequent visitor to the Davenport room, a dedicated scholar. However, he also tells me that a certain blue ink smudge has appeared on the 6th volume of the Rialto Journals, a mark that bears a striking resemblance to a security watermark used by the Swiss Federal Archives." Evelyn Vance didn't blink. "I wouldn't know about that. My research is focused on text, not margins. If there is a smudge, perhaps Finch's erratic behavior extends to his handling of the artifacts. Or perhaps," Wolfe suggested, leaning forward, "someone who was trying to compare the journals to a set of documents they had recently acquired left the mark. Documents that prove Alistair Finch died in Switzerland, but also prove that he had a brother who survived him. A brother who was an expert in forgery." The colour drained from her face, but she didn't lose her composure. "If you're suggesting I'm involved in a conspiracy, Mr. Wolfe, you'll need more than a smudge of ink to prove it. The fact remains that the man in this house cannot prove he is who he says he is." "He doesn't have to," Wolfe snapped, his patience finally fraying. "In this house we don't prove identity, we expose the reasons for its theft. You, Mr. Thorne, and Mr. Reed are not interested in Finch's soul. You are interested in the fact that the Rialto journals contain a hidden map to the Davenport family's offshore holdings, a map that Finch was beginning to decode. You needed him removed so that Thorne could liquidate the estate before the university realized the collection's true value." "That's a lie," she cried, but the pitch of her voice was too high, the denial too sharp. "Is it?" Wolfe asked. "Archie, show her the photocopy of the missing person report for Arthur Finch, the one dated 1994, the one that was removed from the university's personnel file 3 days before the anonymous packet was sent." I pulled the paper from my desk and laid it in front of her. She didn't look at it. She looked at Wolfe, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. This home invasion had been a mistake. By trying to discredit Finch, they had invited Wolfe to look into the very history they were trying to hide. "You have 20 minutes to decide, Dr. Vance," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "Either you tell me who provided the Swiss records, or I call Inspector Cramer and suggest he look into the bank accounts of the Davenport estate's executor. I suspect he will find a series of payments to a certain university investigator that are quite difficult to explain as legal fees." She sat there for a long moment, her hands shaking in her lap. Then, without a word, she stood, grabbed her briefcase, and left the office. She didn't say goodbye, and I didn't show her. We both knew the game was over. The catalyst had been triggered, and the eruption was only a matter of time. The office felt unusually cramped that night, as if the air itself was thickening with the debris of a dozen academic lies. Wolfe was back in his chair, his eyes closed, his fingers doing that rhythmic dance on the arms that usually meant he was mentally rearranging the universe. I was at my desk, finishing a report on the background of Marcus Reed when I noticed it. It wasn't something obvious, like a broken window or a missing safe. It was the kind of subtle wrongness that only someone who lives in the brownstone would catch. The small globe on the corner of Wolfe's desk, the one he uses to trace the voyages of his more obscure historical figures, had been rotated exactly 90 degrees to the west. I didn't say a word. I stood up, moved to the desk, and looked closer. Beneath the base of the globe, tucked into the tiny gap where the brass met the mahogany, was a sliver of paper. It was a single, torn corner of a parchment that looked centuries old, bearing nothing but a fragment of a hand-drawn coastline in blue ink. "Archie," Wolfe rumbled, not opening his eyes, "you are hovering. It is a disruptive habit." "We've had a visitor, sir," I said, my voice low. "Someone was in here while we were at dinner." They didn't take the satchel, but they left a calling card, or maybe they were interrupted. There's a piece of the Rialto journal stuck under your globe. Wolfe's eyes snapped open. He didn't look at me, he looked at the globe. He didn't move for a long minute, but I could see the expansion of his chest that signaled a surge of cold, focused anger. To Wolfe, a trespass into this room was a violation of his very being. The fact that someone had breached our perimeter and dared to touch his desk was an affront that required more than just a legal solution. It required a total demolition of the offender. "Get Fritz," Wolfe commanded, "and call Saul Panzer now." Fritz arrived in seconds, looking genuinely distressed. He hadn't seen anyone, and the security bolts on the front and back doors were still in place. That meant our visitor hadn't used a crowbar. They had used a key, or they were already inside. My mind went to Finch, but the old scholar was tucked away in the guest room on the 3rd floor, probably vibrating with anxiety. "The basement service entrance," I muttered. "The lock is old, and a man like Marcus Reed would know how to navigate a university's skeleton key system. He didn't come for the satchel because he knew I'd be checking the safe first. He came to see if we had the missing page, the one Finch was supposed to have stolen." "No, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, resonant purr. "He came to plant it. If the police were to arrive now and find a fragment of a multi-million-dollar stolen manuscript in my office, our client's credibility would be incinerated, and mine along with it. It is a clumsy but effective method of silencing a troublesome inquiry." Saul Panzer arrived 20 minutes later, slipping through the back door like a shadow. He took one look at the fragment under the globe and then at Wolfe's face. He didn't need a lecture. "The university's security firm is Reed and Associates, Mr. Wolfe," Saul reported, his voice a steady rasp. "I did a little checking on the way over. Marcus Reed doesn't just work for the university, he owns the company that handles their sensitive archives. He's been in and out of Davenport for years. He's the one who's been skimming the collection, replacing the originals with high-grade forgeries. Thorne provided the buyers, and Vance provided the academic cover." "And Finch?" I asked. "Where does he fit?" "Finch found out," Wolfe said, his eyes fixed on the blue ink fragment. "The real Alistair Finch did die in Switzerland, but the man in our guest room is indeed his twin, Arthur. They switched places years ago, a private arrangement between brothers. Our client is a master of forgery himself, which is how he spotted the fakes in the Davenport collection. He couldn't go to the police without exposing his own identity, so he tried to correct the catalogue quietly. That made him a threat to Reed's operation. The erasure was meant to hide a much larger theft. The pressure in the room was almost visible now. We had the motive, we had the method, and we had the trespass." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. "Archie," he said, "tomorrow at 9 we shall have a final gathering. Summon them all. Tell them the ghost has decided to speak, and that he has brought the original Rialto journals with him. We shall see how many of them are prepared to go to jail for a blue ink smudge." I went to the phone. The brownstone was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap. As I dialed Vane's number, I looked over at Wolfe. He was staring at the globe, his jaw set. The person who had moved that map had made a fatal error. They had shown Wolfe the way to their own destruction. The doorbell rang at 9 o'clock sharp, a sound that usually signals the start of a productive day but currently felt like the first note of a funeral march. I stood in the hallway adjusting my tie and making sure my shoulder holster wasn't making a conspicuous lump under my jacket. The air in the brownstone was charged, vibrating with the kind of tension that makes your teeth ache. Fritz was in the kitchen, keeping a watchful eye on the service entrance, and Saul Panzer was tucked away in the dining room, a silent shadow ready to move if the academic debate turned into a brawl. One by one they arrived, Silas Vane, looking like he'd been carved out of cold marble, Julian Thorne, whose expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he was sweating through, his silk shirt, and Marcus Reed, who entered with the heavy, arrogant tread of a man who thought he held all the keys. I showed them into the office where Wolfe was already seated, his bulk dominating the room like an immovable object. Our client, the man currently known as Alistair Finch, was seated in the red leather chair, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. He clutched his satchel as if it were a life raft. Wolfe didn't offer the group a greeting. He waited until they had settled into the semi-circle of yellow chairs, his eyes moving from one face to the other with the clinical detachment of a biologist examining a particularly unpleasant culture of bacteria. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight pressing against the walls of the room until Thorne finally broke it with a nervous cough. "We're here, Wolfe," Thorne snapped, his voice tight. "You said the ghost had something to say. Let's get on with it. I have a board meeting at 11, and I don't intend to spend my morning discussing ancient history with a man who shouldn't even be in the room." "Your board meeting can wait, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe rumbled, his voice a low melodic growl that immediately silenced the executor. "As for ancient history, we are not here to discuss the 16th century. We are here to discuss the 20th, specifically the art of the swap. Archie, show them the calling card our visitor left under my globe last night." I stepped forward and placed the small, torn fragment of parchment on the desk lamp's base. The blue ink shimmered under the light. I watched Reed's face. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened just enough for me to know he recognized the piece. He'd tried to plant it as a death sentence for Finch's credibility, but in this room it was serving as his own arrest warrant. "That fragment," Wolfe continued, his fingers beginning their rhythmic dance, "is a piece of a high-fidelity forgery. It was meant to implicate Dr. Finch in the theft of the Rialto journals, but its presence here proves something far more interesting. It proves that the person who planted it has access to the university's high-security archives, and the skill to produce the very forgeries that have been slowly replacing the Davenport collection over the last 5 years. Mr. Reed, your security firm has been very thorough. So thorough, in fact, that you've managed to secure the originals for a private market while leaving the university with a collection of very expensive photocopies." "This is preposterous," Silas Vane shouted, half rising from his chair. "Marcus Reed is a trusted officer of this institution. He is a thief of the mind, Mr. Vane," Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing with a cold, sharp light. "And he is not alone. He needed an executor to facilitate the sales and an academic to provide the certificates of authenticity. Mr. Thorne's debts and Dr. Vance's ambitions made them perfect partners. The only problem was our client. He didn't just curate the collection, he loved it. And because he is a master of the craft himself, he saw the blue ink smudge where there should have been none. You didn't try to erase him because he was a fraud, Mr. Reed. You tried to erase him because he was the only one who could see through yours." The pressure in the room peaked. Reed stood up, his hand moving toward his coat, but he stopped when he saw Saul Panzer step into the doorway behind him. The trap had snapped shut. The trespass in the brownstone had been the final fatal move in a game Marcus Reed thought he had already won. Wolfe leaned back, his gaze sweeping the room with a look of profound distaste. The disruption was over, and the truth, as it always does in this house, had finally found its way home. The office was as quiet as a tomb, but for the heavy, ragged breathing of Julian Thorne. Marcus Reed remained standing, his body tensed like a coiled spring, but the presence of Saul Panzer at the door and my own hand resting casually near my holster had dampened his enthusiasm for a physical exit. Wolfe hadn't moved a muscle. He sat behind his desk, a mountain of yellow-shirted intellect, looking at the three men with a cold, clinical detachment that was more terrifying than a raised voice. He was no longer just a private investigator, he was a grandmaster who had just called checkmate 3 moves before his opponent even realized the game had started. The red leather chair groaned as our client, the man who had spent 20 years being Alistair Finch, leaned forward, his goldfish eyes wide behind his spectacles. watching the demolition of his tormentors. "Sit down, Mr. Reed," Wolfe commanded, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "Your physical presence is an intrusion, and your posture is an affront to the gravity of this discussion. We are not in a back alley, we are in a room governed by logic. You have spent years treating the university's heritage as a private inventory, a buffet of rare artifacts to be sampled and sold. You believed that by questioning the identity of the archivist, you could invalidate any evidence he might bring against you. It was a sophisticated gambit, but it suffered from one fundamental flaw. You assumed that a man living a lie cannot recognize one." Reed slowly sank back into his chair, his face a mask of grey, frozen fury. "You can't prove a word of it, Wolfe. A fragment of paper under a globe, a few library records. Any lawyer in town would laugh you out of court. I have a reputation for excellence in security that spans decades. Your reputation is a hollow shell, soon to be crushed by the weight of your own inventory," Wolfe countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous resonant purr. "While you were busy planting evidence in my office last night, Saul Panzer was busy elsewhere. He was visiting a climate-controlled warehouse in Long Island City, one registered to a shell company that bears a striking resemblance to several of Mr. Thorne's failed investments. Inside, he found the original Rialto journals, along with several dozen other lost Davenport manuscripts, all prepared for a clandestine shipment to a buyer in Macau." Julian Thorne let out a jagged, choking sound and buried his face in his hands. Silas Vane, the provost, looked as though he were about to have a stroke, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. He looked at Reed, then at Thorne, then at the desk, his world of academic prestige collapsing into a sordid heap of grand larceny. The betrayal was complete, and the strategic maneuvering that had begun with a dusty satchel had led directly to a warehouse floor and a stack of stolen history. "The ghost you tried to conjure has indeed spoken, Mr. Reed," Wolfe continued, his eyes narrowing to sharp points of light. But he did not speak of Swiss climbing accidents or dental records. He spoke of watermarks, of ink composition, and of the unique, irreproducible soul of a 16th century hand. He recognized your forgeries because he is a man who knows that a name is merely a label, but the work is the man himself. You tried to erase Dr. Finch to save your profit, but in doing so, you ensured that every eye in the state will now be focused on your ledgers. The university will survive this scandal, but you, Mr. Thorne, and the absent Dr. Vance will not. Your career as a sentinel of history is over. You are now merely a footnote in a criminal record." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle, the tension in the room finally breaking as the heavy tread of Inspector Cramer's men echoed in the hallway. The disruption that had entered the brownstone with a nervous scholar was being escorted out in handcuffs. I moved to the window, watching the unmarked cars pull up to the curb, their sirens silent but their purpose clear. The brownstone was once again a sanctuary, the air beginning to clear of the scent of old paper and new lies. Wolfe closed his eyes, a sign that the intellectual labor was finished and the transition to dinner could begin. The mountain had shifted, the truth had been mapped, and the scholar's hidden past had finally been brought into the light of day. The office was now occupied by a different sort of tension, the kind that settles in when the hunt is over and only the cleaning up remains. Inspector Cramer stood by the mantel, his hat pushed back, and his jaw working on a piece of gum, as if it were a personal enemy. Two of his men were positioned by the door, and the air was thick with the scent of unwashed raincoats and the ozone of impending legal action. Silas Vane, the provost, had been ushered into the front room to wait for a university lawyer, leaving Marcus Reed and Julian Thorne to face the final cold accounting across Wolfe's desk. Thorne was a huddle of misery, his silk-clad shoulders shaking, while Reed remained stiff and silent, a man who had bet his life on a secret and lost it in a mahogany-paneled room on West 35th Street. "All right, Wolfe," Cramer barked, breaking the silence with the grace of a sledgehammer. "I've got your man Panzer at the warehouse in Long Island City. He says he's looking at enough stolen parchment to buy a battleship. My boys have the Macau shipping manifests, and we found the matching stamp in Reed's private office. It's neat as a pin, but I want to hear it from you. How did a guy who died in Switzerland 30 years ago end up being the one to hand us the keys?" Wolfe didn't even look up from the small blue ink fragment on his desk. He picked up his glass of beer, took a measured swallow, and sighed. "The how, Inspector, is a matter of biology. The why is a matter of character. Our client is indeed Arthur Finch. His brother Alistair was the one who perished in the Alps. They were twins, and when Alistair died, Arthur, who had already established himself as a master of the very craft Reed used for his forgeries, stepped into his brother's life. It was a private exchange of identities, born of a mutual devotion to the Davenport collection. Arthur did not steal a life, he preserved a legacy. For 20 years he worked in that library, not as an impostor, but as a silent partner to his brother's ghost." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Reed, his eyes hard and merciless. Mr. Reed discovered the truth. He didn't care about the ethics of the switch, he saw it as leverage. He began the systematic looting of the collection, knowing that Arthur Finch couldn't cry out without revealing his own secret. Reed turned the university's archives into a deception factory. He produced forgeries that were good enough to deceive an administrator, but not a man who had spent his life becoming the very person he was pretending to be. When Finch began to document the discrepancies, Reed decided to play his final card, the anonymous packet. He sought to erase the witness by exposing the man. "It was a perfect setup," I added, leaning against my desk. Reed had the dental records, the birth certificates, and the motive. He even tried to plant a stolen page in this office last night to make us look like accomplices. But he forgot that Wolfe doesn't care about what a birth certificate says. He cares why someone is waving it in his face. The moment Reed tried to prove Finch was a ghost, he admitted that Finch was a threat. "Identity," Wolfe murmured, his voice dropping to a low, resonant purr, "is not a collection of records. It is a consistency of purpose. Mr. Reed, you are a sentinel-turned-predator. You looked at the Davenport journals and saw only the price of the paper. Our client looked at them and saw his brother's soul. You were undone not by a Swiss hospital record, but by a blue ink smudge that you were too arrogant to realize would be spotted by a man who knows the soul of a manuscript. Archie, the phone. Tell the district attorney that the ghost is ready to sign his true name to the warrants." As Cramer's men led Reed and Thorne out, the office finally began to feel like itself again. The disruption had been purged, the truth had been mapped, and the scholar's hidden past had been reconciled with the present. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing, the intellectual labor of the day finished. I watched the taillights of the squad cars disappear into the New York night, thinking about the two brothers who had switched lives in the mountains so many years ago. They had sought to save a collection of old paper, and in the end, it was the paper that had saved them. The office was finally empty of the law, the ambitious and the greedy, leaving behind only the faint scent of wet wool and the heavy, lingering presence of 100 exposed secrets. Inspector Cramer had departed with his prisoners and his gum, and the squad cars had long since carried the wreckage of the university's prestige down 35th Street. Our client, the man who was officially Arthur but had spent 2 decades being Alistair, stood by the red leather chair. He looked as though a physical weight had been lifted from his narrow shoulders, yet he remained a man caught between two worlds, his satchel still clutched to his chest like a holy relic. He looked at Wolfe, who remained immobile behind his desk, then at the fragment of blue-inked parchment that had started the final collapse of Marcus Reed's empire. "It is over, Mr. Finch," Wolfe said. his voice dropping to a low, respectful resonance that he rarely afforded anyone. Or perhaps I should say Mr. Arthur Finch. The district attorney has agreed that given the circumstances of the last 20 years and your role in preserving the Davenport collection, the matter of your identity will be handled with administrative discretion. You have not defrauded the university. You have protected it from a predator who was far more dangerous than any ghost in the library. Your brother's work is secure, and more importantly, it is now authenticated by the truth rather than a lie. Arthur Finch blinked, his goldfish eyes damp behind his thick spectacles. I never wanted to be a hero, Mr. Wolfe. I only wanted to finish the catalogue. Alistair was brilliant, the one the world expected. I was just the shadow that knew how to make the ink match. I thought by becoming him, I could keep his brilliance alive. I didn't realize that by hiding, I was making it easier for men like Reed to steal it all away. Brilliance is a solitary flame, Mr. Finch, but integrity is the heart that keeps it from being blown out by the first cold wind of greed, Wolfe remarked, his fingers beginning their final rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. You may return to your library. The university will require your expertise to distinguish the remaining forgeries from the originals. I suspect they will find your erratic behavior was the only thing that saved their heritage. Archie, see Mr. Finch to the door, and ensure he has a taxi. The New York night is no place for a man who has just returned from the dead. I showed him out, and as the front door clicked shut, I felt the brownstone settle back into its customary state of clockwork tranquility. The disruption had been purged, the sanctuary had been restored, and the mountain was back on its throne. When I returned to the office, the lights were low, and Wolfe was staring at the small globe on his desk, the one that had been rotated by a thief in the night. He reached out and adjusted it back to its proper orientation, with a touch that was surprisingly delicate for a man of his displacement. The game was finished, the ledger was balanced, and the only thing left to settle was the matter of dinner. Well, I said, sliding into my chair and pulling the typewriter toward me for the final entry in the files, that was quite a detour into the ivory tower. I guess the lesson is that you should never trust a man with a birth certificate and a grudge, or a man who thinks he can swap a 16th century map for a bank account in Macau. It's a good thing you like old paper, sir, or we'd be out a very healthy consultation fee. Wolfe shifted his gaze from the globe to me, his eyes sharp and clear in the soft light. I do not like old paper, Archie. I like the precision of the mind that created it. Mr. Reed and his associates were not merely thieves, they were vandals of the intellect. They sought to replace the unique with the uniform, the authentic with the convenient. It is a modern disease, and one that I find particularly offensive. They believe that because a name can be changed, the truth can be altered. They have discovered at a significant cost that the truth is the only thing in this world that cannot be forged. Fritz appeared in the doorway, announcing that dinner was served. We moved into the dining room, where the table was set with its usual impeccable grace. The menu was a simple but elegant poulet anglais, followed by a salad of bitter greens. There wasn't a blue ink smudge or a forged manuscript in sight. As Wolfe took his first bite, a look of profound satisfaction spread across his face, a man who had successfully defended his borders and restored the sanctity of his house. The scholar's hidden past had been brought into the light, and for the first time in a week, the only thing being weighed in the office was the quality of the beer. The following morning, the brownstone had returned to its customary state of clockwork tranquility, a condition that Wolfe guards with more ferocity than a dragon guards its hoard. The New York sun was trying its best to penetrate the office windows, casting long, clean rectangles across the Persian rug, where Marcus Reed and his cohorts had stood less than 24 hours ago. I was at my desk, the typewriter clacking a steady rhythm as I finished the final report for the files. It's a ritual we have. Once the shouting stops and the handcuffs click, I put it all down on paper so Wolfe can forget about it, and I can remember why we're still in business." The ivory tower had turned out to be more of a den of thieves, but the ledger was balanced, the university's prestige was salvaged, and the orchids upstairs were finally getting the undivided attention they demanded. Wolfe had been in the plant rooms since 9, probably apologizing to his odontoglossums for the intrusion of a criminal investigation. At exactly 11 o'clock the elevator hummed and the door slid open. Wolfe stepped out, looking like a well-fed mountain in a fresh yellow silk vest. He crossed the room to his oversized chair, performed the complex maneuver of seating himself, and looked at me with an expression that was almost, but not quite, pleasant. He didn't speak immediately, he just adjusted his bulk and let the silence of the room settle around him like a comfortable blanket. The disruption was over, the sanctuary was restored, and the only thing left to settle was the final philosophical accounting. "The report is finished, I assume?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual deep, resonant rumble. "Just typing the period on the last sentence," I said, sliding the folder into the top drawer. "The district attorney's office called an hour ago. They've got Reed in a cell, and Thorne is already talking about a plea deal. The Macau shipment was intercepted at the docks, and they've recovered the entire Rialto set. Silas Vane sent over a letter of thanks that's so full of academic jargon, I needed a dictionary to find the thank you part. But the check was in English, and the numbers were quite clear." Wolfe made a sound that might have been a grunt of approval. "Mr. Vane's gratitude is as hollow as his administration. He is not thankful for the truth, he is thankful for the containment of a scandal. He would have been just as happy to see Dr. Finch erased if it could have been done without the police on his doorstep. He is a man who values the appearance of integrity more than the substance of it." "And Arthur Finch?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "I dropped him off at the university library this morning. He looked like a man who just found $100 in an old coat pocket. He's back in the Davenport room, sorting through the forgeries. He says it's going to take him years to fix what Reed broke." Wolfe shifted his gaze to the small globe on his desk, the one that had been rotated by a thief in the night. "Identity, Archie, is a fragile construction. We spend our lives building a persona out of paper, names and expectations, yet the soul remains a stubborn, uncopyable thing. Arthur Finch spent 20 years being a ghost, yet he was more real than Marcus Reed, who had all the proper credentials and not a shred of honor. Reed believed that because he could replicate ink and parchment, he could replicate the man. He discovered, at a significant cost, that the truth has a weight that no forgery can carry. He also discovered that you don't like it when people touch your globe," I quipped. Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly, a sign of a rare, dry amusement. "That was his most egregious error. A man who violates the sanctity of another's workspace reveals a fundamental lack of respect for the order of the universe. It is a symptom of a disordered mind. He sought to move the world to suit his greed, and instead he moved himself directly into a prison cell. It is a satisfying symmetry." Fritz appeared in the doorway, announcing that lunch was served. We moved into the dining room, where the table was set with its usual impeccable grace. The menu was a simple but elegant omelette aux fines herbes, followed by a salad of watercress. There wasn't a blue ink smudge or a stolen manuscript in sight. As Wolfe took his first bite, a look of profound satisfaction spread across his face, a man who had successfully defended his borders and restored the sanctity of his house. The scholar's hidden past had been brought into the light, and for the first time in a week the only thing being weighed in the office was the quality of the beer and the precision of the afternoon schedule. "Archie," Wolfe said, just as I was reaching for the salad. "Sir, remind me to tell Theodore that the phalaenopsis in the north window requires more humidity. It is becoming as brittle as Julian Thorne's excuses." I grinned and kept eating. The true north of the brownstone had been found, and it pointed, as always, toward the kitchen and the plant rooms.